Okay, so you know how sometimes there's a news story that comes out and you just know right away it's a big one?
Yeah.
That's kind of how I felt when Canada's security agency, CIS, uh, put out this warning about foreign countries maybe trying to mess with our election coming up on April 28th.
I agree with you there. Anytime a country's intelligence agency comes out and specifically says, hey, these other countries might try to influence our elections, that's a huge deal.
Right, and it's not just a Canadian thing. It feels like everyone around the world should be paying attention to this.
Definitely, because it really highlights how interconnected everything is these days and how vulnerable democratic systems are.
Yeah, and it's not like the old spy movie stuff either. I mean, I'm sure some of that is still going on. But what's really different this time is that CSIS specifically mentioned China and how they might be using artificial intelligence to interfere. That's next level stuff.
Absolutely, it really takes things to a whole new level of sophistication. Think about it for a second. AI can create fake news articles, videos, social media posts, all sorts of stuff that looks totally real, and they can do it super fast.
And they can target very specific groups of people with that content.
Exactly. That's the scary part. It makes these influence operations so much more believable and effective on a much larger scale than ever before.
Okay, so let's start with China. Vanessa Lloyd, the deputy director at CSIS, basically said it was almost certain that China would use AI to try and sway the election here in Canada.
Yeah, she didn't mince words. She said it was highly likely. And it's not just about the technology itself. China also seems to be using social media to spread narratives that support their own interests.
So AI creates the content and social media spreads it around.
Basically, it's a powerful combination.
What's really unsettling is that it seems like they're specifically targeting Chinese communities here in Canada,
hmm
and they're using these really sneaky methods. It just feels wrong.
It raises some serious questions about trust within those communities. If people feel like they're being manipulated, especially through channels they normally trust, that can be really damaging. It could erode their sense of belonging and make them lose faith in the whole democratic process.
All right, let's switch gears for a second and talk about India. It's interesting that they haven't really responded to these accusations from CSIS.
hmm
You'd think they'd deny it, but so far, nothing.
Yeah, that is noteworthy. Silence from a country in this kind of situation can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Maybe they just don't want to give the allegations more attention, or maybe they're still figuring out how they want to respond.
But we should remember, this isn't the first time Canada has brought up these concerns about India.
You're right. Just a few months ago, there was that report on foreign interference in Ottawa's elections back in January.
And India pushed back pretty hard on those accusations, too. Their Ministry of External Affairs said they completely rejected any insinuations that India was involved.
Right. And not only that, but they basically turned it around and criticized Canada's immigration policies. It felt like they were trying to change the subject.
Yeah, it definitely felt like a classic way to deflect attention when you're facing an accusation. Just point the finger back at the other guy.
Exactly, a way to create confusion and take the heat off yourself.
And then there were those reports in the Globe and Mail earlier this year that said India was allegedly using these go-betweens to secretly give money to candidates in 3 different Canadian political parties. So it sounds like they might be using some of those more traditional methods of influencing elections too.
Right, alongside any digital stuff they might be doing. And those more traditional methods like funneling money to campaigns can be harder to track, but they can have a really direct impact on who wins an election and what policies they might pursue.
All right, let's move on to Russia and Pakistan. It sounds like they're using different approaches, but they're still pretty worrying. Russia seems to be focused on building up these networks on social media and on news websites so they can spread their own version of events.
Yeah, it's like they're creating their own little information bubbles or ecosystems where they control the narrative and try to influence how Canadians see the world.
And CSIS is warning that Russia might use these networks to spread disinformation and interfere in our election. They're basically saying Canada is a potential target for their propaganda.
And Russia has a long history of doing this kind of stuff all over the world, using disinformation to create chaos and make people distrust their own governments and institutions. They're experts at finding and exploiting weaknesses in society. So this warning from CSIS should be taken very seriously.
As for Pakistan, it seems like they're mostly interested in trying to make sure their country is stable, and they're pushing back against India's influence globally. And it sounds like they might even try to get involved in Canadian elections to further those goals.
It just goes to show you that elections in one country are rarely isolated events anymore. A country's own interests and how they get along with other countries can lead them to do things in places you wouldn't expect, like in a Canadian election, because they think it will help them achieve their bigger goals.
And speaking of bigger goals, we can't really talk about Canada and India without mentioning what happened last September, when Prime Minister Trudeau accused India of being involved in the assassination of that Khalistani separatist leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
Oh, yeah, that created a huge rift between the two countries.
And things haven't really gotten any better since then. So that whole situation has to be affecting how people are viewing these allegations of election interference.
Of course it does. When there's already a lot of tension and mistrust between two countries, any accusations of interference are going to be seen through that lens. It makes it much harder to figure out what really happened and to de-escalate the situation.
So basically, Canada is heading into this election knowing that there could be interference from a bunch of different countries using all sorts of tactics, from high-tech AI-driven disinformation campaigns to good old-fashioned underhanded financial dealings. It makes you wonder if any democracy can really protect itself in this kind of environment.
Well, I don't think any country can ever be completely immune to foreign interference. The people who want to interfere have a lot of resources, and they're always coming up with new ways to do it, but democracies can definitely make it much harder for them to succeed.
How do they do that?
Well, for one thing, they need to have strong intelligence agencies that can gather information and figure out what's going on. They also need to have laws in place that make it illegal to interfere in elections, and they need to enforce those laws. But it's not just about the government. Regular people need to be aware of the problem too.
What can regular people do about it?
Well, they need to be able to spot disinformation when they see it, and they need to think critically about the information they come across online and in the news. And social media companies also have a role to play. They need to do more to prevent the spread of disinformation on their platforms.
So it's a multi-pronged approach. Governments, social media companies, and individuals all have to work together.
Exactly. It's a shared responsibility.
And the effects of this interference don't just disappear after the election is over, do they? If there are credible allegations of foreign meddling, it could lead to people questioning the legitimacy of the results.
Yeah.
And it could cause even more damage to Canada's relationships with these countries.
You're absolutely right. If people lose faith in the fairness of their elections, it can undermine democracy itself. And if there's solid proof that a foreign country interfered, it would definitely have a huge impact on diplomatic relations, potentially for years to come.
All right, so let's recap what we've learned today about this whole issue of election interference. What are the key takeaways?
I think there are three main things to remember. First, the methods of foreign interference are getting more and more sophisticated. They're using cutting-edge technology like AI to create disinformation that's very hard to detect. Second, Canada isn't the only target. Multiple countries, each with their own agendas, are trying to influence elections all over the world. And third, this is all happening against a backdrop of really complex and often tense global politics, which makes the situation even more risky and difficult to deal with.
And for everyone listening out there, this really shows how connected the world is. What happens online and what happens in the world of international relations, it can all have a direct impact on something as important as our elections and our ability to govern ourselves.
Exactly. It's not just an academic issue anymore. It's something that affects all of us. We all need to be aware of these potential threats, and we need to think critically about the information we're exposed to every day. If we want to protect our democracies in the 21st century, that's essential.
It's definitely a lot to think about. We're living in a world where global politics and technology are constantly changing and influencing each other. So how do we as individuals and as a nation navigate this incredibly complicated landscape? How do we make sure that our democratic systems are strong and resilient enough to withstand these kinds of pressures? That's the challenge we're facing, and I think it's going to be a central question for a long time to come.
Absolutely. I agree.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back next week with another episode, so be sure to tune in.